A king who never lost a war is about to lose something far more dangerous than a battle. Not to rebellion, not to treason, not to bloodshed, but to a decision already made. In the final years of the 13th century, England's crown believed it still controlled every future that mattered: marriages arranged, alliances sealed, bloodlines preserved. Authority moved forward because it always had. Orders were given, obedience followed, until one royal woman did not argue, did not flee, did not ask permission. She simply stood still. By the time the crown noticed, the choice was already lawful. By the time the king reacted, the damage was irreversible. By the time power raised its voice, it discovered no one was listening. This is not a love story. It is not a scandal. It is the moment authority learned that consent, once withdrawn, does not return quietly. And once a crown is forced to wait, it never rules the same way again. Power doesn't ask for permission. It moves quietly, decides quickly, and leaves consequences behind. What you're about to hear is not legend. It is history told without illusion. This is a historical power story. She was born in a city that did not belong to England. Acre 1272, stone walls baked by eastern sun, salt air mixed with incense and iron. Outside the fortress, banners of the Crusades snapped in restless wind. Inside, a royal child entered the world without ceremony, without audience, without her future present. Joan was the daughter of a king, but the king was already moving on. Edward of England had wars to finish, thrones to secure, reputations to harden. His daughter was wrapped, named, recorded, and left behind in safer hands across the sea. She would grow not beneath a crown, but beneath instruction, not beneath affection, but beneath expectation. From the beginning, distance shaped her. She learned early that power rarely arrives as warmth. It arrives as an absence. Decisions were made far away by men she could not see. Love was conditional. Value was permanent. Courtiers spoke of her future in lowered voices. She was an asset waiting to be claimed, a bond waiting to be sealed. No one asked who she would become. Joan listened. Children raised in courts learn silence before speech. They learn how to watch without being seen, how to stand without being chosen, how to belong without attachment. Joan mastered this language instinctively. By the time England remembered her, she had already learned the most dangerous lesson of all. A person who grows up without being held does not break easily when released. England reclaimed her slowly. Years passed before Joan was brought west, across water she did not remember crossing. When she arrived, the court expected gratitude. Instead, they found composure. She watched halls instead of running through them. She listened longer than children were meant to. Servants mistook her quiet for fragility. They were wrong. Her mother, Eleanor of Castile, ruled through presence, efficiency, and warmth carefully measured. Joan studied her from a distance, learning how authority could be gentle and still absolute. Her father remained intermittent, a voice more than a figure. When he appeared, rooms tightened. Joan observed how fear organized itself. Education followed protocol. Languages, prayer, etiquette, lineage. What mattered was not knowledge but placement. She learned where to stand, when to bow, and how to wait. Waiting became a skill. Waiting became armor. She understood early that daughters of kings were promises, not people. Their futures were drafted long before their consent could matter. Joan did not rebel against this truth. She memorized it. At night, when the court dimmed, she practiced something rarer than obedience. She practiced stillness. Stillness meant survival. Stillness meant invisibility. And invisibility, she learned, could become leverage. No one noticed the discipline forming behind her eyes. No one suspected that patience, once learned, could be turned outward. The court believed time shaped children. They did not consider that children might study time in return. Joan already understood how waiting could become a weapon. In the future ahead, by the time Joan understood her name carried weight, she also understood it carried no voice. She heard it spoken in negotiations before it was spoken to her. The girl, the daughter, the match. Men measured her future in acres and alliances, not years. She was discussing the way castles were discussed, by location, by usefulness, by what could be gained if she were placed correctly. Affection was present but distant. Care existed but conditional. Joan learned the difference early. Love lingered, power calculated. She noticed how servants stiffened when messengers arrived, how courtiers adjusted themselves when her father's seal appeared. Authority moved through rooms without entering them. Joan watched this with the attention of someone who knew it would one day move through her as well. What unsettled the court was not her obedience, but her calm. She did not cling. She did not ask questions meant to change outcomes. She accepted instruction without gratitude and correction without shame. That unsettled people more than resistance ever could. In private, her tutors praised her temperament. In council, her name continued to circulate like currency. Joan realized something subtle and irreversible. She was not precious. She was replaceable. And because she was replaceable, she began to detach. Emotion, once loosened, became optional. Attachment became something one chose, not something one owed. The court mistook her restraint for emptiness. They did not see preparation. When the first rumors of marriage drifted into her hearing, Joan did not flinch. She only noted how confidently everyone spoke, how certain they were that she would go where she was sent. She stored that certainty away. One day, she would decide whether to carry it. In 1278, the court decided her future aloud. Joan was 6 when whispers hardened into plans, and 12 when plans became law. Marriage was announced as protection, not transfer. No one used the word sale, though everyone understood it. The man chosen for her was powerful, ancient by court measure, and useful. Gilbert de Clare's name moved corridors before his body ever did. Estates followed it. Armies followed it. Joan listened as if listening were consent. Preparation intensified. Gowns were fitted to a growing frame. Lessons narrowed. She was taught how to enter rooms and how to leave them without sound. Obedience was not demanded. It was assumed. That assumption pressed heavier than command. In the morning she was told, no choice was offered. She nodded once. The court exhaled. Compliance was mistaken for ease. It was neither. Joan studied the transaction with precision. A daughter moved. A boarder steadied. A king secured loyalty without drawing steel. She understood the elegance of it and the cost. At the chapel door, she paused long enough for one thought to settle. If obedience was expected, then refusal would someday be catastrophic. Better, she decided, to master obedience first, to learn its shape, its limits, its seams. She crossed the threshold composed, crowned by certainty that was not her own. Years later, that certainty would crack, not loudly, legally. And history would notice then. She married at 12, but the ceremony felt older than anyone present. The wedding took place late in 1278, beneath stone arches heavy with history. Nobles gathered. Blessings were spoken. Vows were exchanged that belonged to tradition more than to the child standing inside them. Joan's hands did not tremble. She had learned already that steadiness invited less scrutiny. Gilbert de Clare towered beside her, rich in land and consequence. He did not look cruel. He did not need to. Power did not require menace when law stood behind it. The court watched closely, searching for tears, fear, resistance. They found none. Her stillness reassured them. That night marked her transfer from daughter to countess, from possibility to possession. Titles wrapped around her like armor she had not chosen but would be expected to wear well. England congratulated itself on order preserved. Inside, something different settled. Joan understood now how obedience functioned. It closed doors. It ended with questions. It created stability for everyone except the one who surrendered it. She did not hate the role she was given. Hatred wasted energy. She learned instead how to inhabit it. Years would pass before anyone noticed how much she observed, how carefully she stored moments of imbalance, small fractures in authority others ignored. As the candles burned low and the court turned away, Joan realized the most dangerous truth of all. Obedience could be perfected, and anything perfected could be reversed eventually. The court expected transformation. It did not happen. Years passed, and Joan grew into her title without ever disappearing inside it. By her early teens, she moved through great halls with practiced ease, neither deferential nor bold. Observant, composed. The household of Gloucester learned quickly that their young countess noticed everything. Gilbert de Clare ruled through magnitude, vast lands, armed men, ancestral weight. Joan ruled through presence. She learned when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. Servants adjusted their pace around her. Stewards answered questions before she asked them. Power began to recognize her quietly. By the mid-1280s, she was no longer seen as a child placed beside a lord, but as a fixed element of the household's order. She signed documents. She listened to disputes. She watched how men yielded not to volume but to certainty. Marriage did not soften her, it sharpened her. She learned how authority could be borrowed, how it could be exercised without ownership. Most importantly, she learned that power respected competence more than blood when blood was absent. The court congratulated itself again. The girl had settled. The alliance was held. The daughter was contained. They did not see the difference between containment and control. Joan had mastered her position completely, and mastery, once achieved, had a habit of seeking direction. Ahead of her lay decades, the court believed it had already been written. Joan, listening, began to imagine revisions. By 1287, Joan understood the rhythms of power better than most men twice her age. She watched how disputes were settled long before they reached the Lord's table, who spoke first, who waited, who interrupted, and who was allowed to finish. Authority, she learned, was not declared, it was acknowledged. Gilbert commanded through scale. Joan refined through detail. She remembered names. She recalled promises. She noticed when accounts did not align. The household adjusted not because she demanded it, but because precision created trust. People brought her problems they did not bring to her husband. This unsettled some, though few could name why. A countess was meant to represent stability, not influence. Yet influence gathered around her quietly. Servants deferred. Lesser nobles listened. Even knights paused when she held their gaze. Joan did not challenge her husband. She did not need to. She operated beside him, not beneath him. Her authority did not compete. It complemented me. That made it invisible to those who only feared open rivalry. At court she was praised for temperament. The word carried approval but also dismissal. Temperament implied compliance. Joan accepted the compliment without correction. Inside, she noted something critical. Power did not resist her because it did not recognize her as a threat. That realization stayed with her. Years later, when power finally noticed her choices, it would already be too late. By the early 1920s, endurance had become Joan's reputation. She bore children, managed absences, received guests, and absorbed long seasons of quiet responsibility without spectacle. Motherhood did not soften her authority, it deepened it. Each birth tightened her position within the great machinery of land and lineage. Each child bound her more firmly to a future she had not chosen, but now understood. Gilbert's power remained unquestioned, yet it was Joan who ensured continuity. When he traveled, order was held. When disputes arose, they resolved themselves faster in her presence. The household learned to function as though she were permanent. That permanence mattered. Joan learned the cost of patience. She learned how much of herself could be set aside without vanishing entirely. Endurance, she discovered, was not submission. It was delayed. It allowed one to survive long enough to decide. Court chroniclers would later describe these years as uneventful. That judgment itself revealed ignorance. Nothing that builds power quietly is ever uneventful. By 1295, rumors of illness began to circulate. Gilbert weakened. The household prepared not for grief, but for transition. Joan watched this shift with the clarity of someone who had lived long inside other people's decisions. When Gilbert died that year, England marked the loss of a great lord. Joan marked something else entirely. For the first time since her birth in Acre, she stood without a man placed over her by command. Widowed at 23, wealthy, titled, and legally independent, she had become something the crown had not planned for. A woman who could choose. Widowhood arrived in 1295 without warning but not without consequence. The court moved first, as it always did, wrapping condolences around calculations. Black cloth was ordered. Letters were sent. Estates were reviewed. Joan stood at the center of it, composed, listening, already aware that sympathy was temporary and authority impatient. For the first time, she signed alone. Seals pressed into wax without anyone correcting her hand. She felt the difference immediately. Freedom was not noise. It was quiet. It was a space where instruction used to be. England mistook that silence for vulnerability. Within months, messengers began to appear. Proposals traveled faster than grief. Each carried the same reassurance: protection, stability, continuation. No one asked what she wanted. Everyone assumed relief would make her pliable. Joan did not correct them. She wore mourning properly. She attended where expected. She did nothing to announce that something fundamental had shifted. Inside, she assessed her position with the calm of someone long trained to wait. She controlled vast lands. She answered no husband. Her children secured her legitimacy. The law for now stood beside her. Power noticed only part of this. The crown saw a widowed daughter ready to be placed again. Joan saw time. And time, once recognized, could be arranged. When word reached her that the king was already speaking of her future, she did not react. She began quietly to decide it. By 1296, the crown believed it had regained its advantage. Widowhood, in the logic of power, was a temporary condition, a pause, not a position. Joan's independence unsettled advisors, but not enough to alarm them. They had seen widows before. They always returned to the system eventually. Edward's council spoke confidently of continental advantage. Names were exchanged, distances calculated. Joan's hand, once again, became a bridge between interests. The king did not yet command her future aloud, but the machinery was already turning. Joan heard fragments before official words reached her. She heard Savoy mentioned. She heard urgency masked as concern. The crown was not angry. Anger would have signaled resistance. The crown was efficient. That efficiency relied on an assumption older than law, that a daughter, however capable, would comply. Joan did not interrupt the process. She did not object. She did not refuse. She allowed the plans to form fully, cleanly, without obstruction. Power moved best when unchallenged. She understood that now. Instead, she paid attention elsewhere. Within her household, a presence remained constant, a man whose name carried no weight beyond proximity. Ralph de Monthermer did not offer strategy. He offered loyalty without calculation. In a life built on arrangement, that difference mattered. Joan did not name the shift when it began. Nomming made things vulnerable. She let it exist quietly as something unrecorded. The crown continued forward, unaware that it was planning around a future that had already changed. Because control, when assumed, rarely checks for consent. And consent, once withheld, does not announce itself until it is too late. Ralph de Monthermer was not meant to matter. He entered Joan's days as many men did in noble households, present, efficient, unnoticed. A knight of modest standing, his value lay in reliability, not ambition. He kept order. He carried messages. He remained when others sought notice. In a court trained to read status instantly, his insignificance protected him. By the spring of 1296, Joan had learned to distinguish usefulness from loyalty. Useful men spoke early and often. Loyal men waited. Ralph waited. Their conversations began without intent. Brief exchanges at thresholds. Observations shared rather than declared. He did not flatter. He did not advise. He listened as though listening were an act of respect, not opportunity. Joan noticed the absence of expectation and felt, for once, unmeasured. Power had always approached her with conditions. Ralph approached without one. The difference unsettled her more than defiance ever could. She tested it quietly. Delays, silences, small requests made without urgency. Ralph answered each without recording the favor. No leverage followed. In a life governed by transaction, this absence registered as danger. Joan understood what loving a man like this would cost. She understood it before she admitted affection existed at all. The crown could forgive hesitation. It could forgive the delay. It could not forgive a choice that served no purpose. So she said nothing. She let proximity do the work words could not. Affection did not arrive as a rush. It arrived as a pattern. By late 1296, Joan noticed how often Ralph was nearby when decisions ended and silence began. He did not insert himself. He did not retreat either. He remained, steady as furniture, present without demand. In a court where attention was currency, his restraint felt deliberate. She tested the boundary once, then again. A walk taken without announcement. A pause in conversation long enough to invite comment. Ralph filled neither. He adjusted to her pace as though it were natural, as though hierarchy dissolved when not spoken aloud. That unsettled her. Joan had lived her entire life surrounded by men who wanted something: favor, alliance, legacy. Ralph wanted nothing she could not choose to give. The absence of pressure stripped her of rehearsed responses. She found herself speaking honestly without intending to. Rumors never formed. There was nothing to repeat. No gestures large enough to scandalize. No promises spoken. Only proximity allowed to continue longer than propriety would normally permit. Joan understood the danger precisely because it did not announce itself. The crown would not intervene until it could name a threat. This was unnamed, unmeasured, unrecorded. And yet something irreversible had begun. She realized it one evening, standing alone after Ralph had gone, when the room felt altered by his absence. Power had always entered her life loudly. This did not. That made it far more dangerous. Because once a future appears quietly, it becomes difficult to replace. Joan did not confuse affection with illusion. She counted costs before emotions, as she had been trained to do. By the end of 1296, she knew exactly what choosing Ralph would mean: loss of favor, loss of certainty, the possibility of public humiliation, perhaps worse, quiet erasure. The crown did not punish every disobedience loudly. Sometimes it simply withdrew protection and waited for gravity to finish the work. She measured all of this without drama. What surprised her was not the danger but the clarity. For the first time, her future did not arrive pre-written. It existed as a fork she alone could acknowledge. One path preserved order and erased desire. The other preserved loyalty and invited conflict. She delayed neither out of fear nor indecision but out of discipline. Rushed choices belong to the powerless. She watched the crown continue its plans, watched messengers move, negotiations thicken, expectations harden. Ralph did not press. That restraint mattered. It confirmed what she already knew, that whatever bound them would not be demanded, only accepted. One evening, The realization settled with finality. If she chose obedience again, she would survive. If she chose loyalty, she would change the structure that governed her. Joan had endured long enough to understand endurance was not her purpose. When the decision came, it did not arrive with relief. It arrived with resolve. And once resolve takes form, it does not ask permission to exist. It only waits for the moment when concealment becomes action. Joan did not decide in a single moment. She closed in on the decision the way power closes borders, quietly, completely. By early 1297, the court spoke more openly of her future. The name of Savoy surfaced with confidence now, as if repetition alone could make it inevitable. Joan listened without reaction. Reaction would have suggested uncertainty. She had none left. She studied the law instead. Not the law as men declared it, but the law as it endured. Marriage, once valid, could not be undone by anger. Consent, once given, could not be recalled by command. The church did not bend easily, even to kings. These were not theories, they were structures. Ralph remained constant. No promises, no urgency. That constancy mattered more than vows ever could. It meant that what she was about to do would not be forced by fear of loss. It would be chosen. Joan understood the precision required. If she hesitated too long, the crown would move first. If she acted too loudly, it would strike back before the ground settled. The decision needed to exist before it was discovered. So she arranged nothing publicly. No witnesses of rank. No announcement. Only the minimum required for the law to recognize what power would later be forced to accept. When the moment came, it passed without spectacle. No bells, no gathering, just words spoken, binding enough to outlast outrage. Joan of Acre became a wife again. Not by instruction, but by will. And somewhere far away, a king continued planning a future that no longer existed. The marriage existed before the crown knew to forbid it. Sometime in early 1297, quietly and without witnesses of consequence, Joan spoke words that could not be unsaid. The ceremony was small by design. No banners, no nobles, no room for interruption. What mattered was not celebration but recognition. The church would acknowledge it. The law would hold it. Everything else would follow. For a brief window, the world remained unchanged. Joan moved through her household as before. Ralph continued his duties without elevation or display. Nothing about them invited scrutiny. Power, accustomed to spectacle, did not sense the shift. That was the advantage. Marriage, once sealed, became fact. Not an argument, not a request. Fact was the one thing authority could not intimidate. Joan understood this with precision. She had not defied her father. She had acted beyond him. When she realized she was with child, the timing confirmed what she already knew. The decision was now armored. Even a king could not dismantle it without dismantling himself. Still, she did not speak. She allowed the crown to continue its work, to sharpen its plans, to believe control remained intact. Power moved confidently toward a collision it did not yet see. Joan waited, not in fear but in calculation. She knew exactly what would happen when the truth emerged. Lands would be threatened. A man would be punished. Pressure would be applied from every direction. What the crown did not know, what it had never considered, was that the most dangerous moment had already passed. The choice had been made. The law had accepted it. And history had quietly shifted its weight. The king would discover this soon. And when he did, reaction would replace authority. The truth surfaced not through confession, but through inevitability. By mid-1297, the court noticed what silence could no longer conceal. Joan's figure changed. Attendants adjusted gowns more carefully. Questions were asked without being spoken aloud. In royal households, bodies announced what mouths dared not. Pregnancy transformed privacy into evidence. Joan did not deny it when asked. Denial would have invited delay, and delay favored the crown. She acknowledged the condition plainly, without explanation. The absence of apology unsettled those who heard it. Something about her certainty suggested this outcome had been prepared for. Word moved quickly to Edward I, carried by messengers who expected fury and delivered shock instead. The king did not respond at once. Silence from a ruler was never mercy. It was a calculation. Within days, inquiry hardened into discovery. A marriage, secret, lawful, irreversible, each detail arrived like a separate wound. Edward had planned alliances. He had not planned defiance shaped like patience. Orders followed. Joan's lands were placed under royal control. Ralph de Monthermer was seized and imprisoned without ceremony. The court waited for collapse, for pleading, for correction. None came. Joan did not rush to her father. She did not beg for pardon. She remained where she was, pregnant, married, unmoving. The stillness forced the crown to act openly, and in acting openly to reveal its limits. Edward believed force would restore order. He believed time would bring submission. What he did not yet understand was that punishment only works when the punished agree to be moved. And Joan of Acre had already decided she would not. Edward I did not shout. That was what unsettled the court most. From Westminster in the late summer of 1297, orders moved outward with mechanical calm. Lands were seized as procedure, not punishment. Titles were suspended, not revoked. Ralph's imprisonment was framed as correction, not cruelty. The king believed himself measured, reasonable, in control. This was how authority preferred to appear when it expected compliance. Edward assumed his daughter would bend. She always had. Distance, pressure. Removal of privilege. These were tools that had never failed him. Kingdoms had folded under less. A daughter, he believed, would not outlast the system that raised her. Joan received the news without visible reaction. She did not contest the seizures. She did not demand Ralph's release. She did not write letters heavy with emotion. Each expected response was withheld. That absence confused the court. Silence when coming from power was strategy. Silence when coming from the punished was supposed to mean fear. Joan's silence carried neither. It carried weight. Edward waited for negotiation. It did not come. Advisors suggested escalation. Others warned restraint. The church watched carefully. So did nobles who understood precedent when they saw one forming. The king found himself calculating not outcomes but consequences. Joan remained still. Her body carried proof the crown could not erase. Her marriage carried recognition the crown could not revoke. Every day that passed without her capitulation weakened the assumption that obedience was inevitable. Edward had crushed barons and humbled princes. He had never needed to persuade. Now, faced with a daughter who would not move, the king confronted an unfamiliar problem. Force could punish, but it could not undo what had already been lawfully done. And for the first time, authority hesitated. Ralph de Monthermer disappeared into confinement without ceremony. No trial, no public charge. By royal order in 1297, he was placed under guard, removed from sight as though absence itself could correct the mistake he represented. The court approved quietly. This was how errors were usually erased. It did not work. Imprisonment created sympathy where silence had not. Whispers moved through noble circles, careful, measured, dangerous. A knight imprisoned not for treason but for marriage. A husband was punished because a king had been bypassed. The story did not flatter authority. Edward expected Joan to react. She did not. She remained where she was, visibly pregnant, legally married, and unmoved by deprivation. Her lands were held. Her household was reduced. Comfort narrowed. Still, she did not cross the distance to her father. She did not offer a compromise. She did not ask for mercy. That refusal unsettled the machinery of punishment. Punishment relied on urgency. Joan supplied none. Each day Ralph remained imprisoned sharpened the question no one wanted asked aloud. If the marriage was unlawful, why not annul it? If it was lawful, why imprison the husband? The answer satisfied no one. The church remained silent, but observant. Silence from that quarter was never neutral. Edward waited for pressure to do its work. Instead, pressure began to redistribute. Nobles measured precedent. Clerics reviewed canon. Courtiers recalculated loyalty. Joan understood what the king did not. Force had already reached its limit. Anything further would expose weakness. And the crown, sensing the ground shift beneath it, prepared to decide whether it would bend or break something it could not afford to lose. The moment of decision was approaching, and it would not belong to the king alone. She did not travel to Westminster. Joan understood that movement would be read as surrender. In the autumn of 1297, she remained where she was, receiving notices of confiscation without reply. Stillness, she had learned, forced others to speak first. Edward waited for the moment grief would make her compliant. It did not come. What arrived instead was scrutiny. Clerks questioned procedures. Clerics reviewed dispensations. Nobles measured how far royal will could reach before law intervened. Joan met each messenger with the same calm. She did not accuse. She did not explain. She allowed the facts to stand alone. A valid marriage, a child expected, a husband imprisoned without verdict. The court began to sense the trap. To yield looked weak. To persist risked precedent. Edward had conquered Wales and broken barons. Here, neither threat nor delay produced obedience. Joan waited not passively but precisely. Each day increased the cost of reversal. Each silence narrowed the king's options. When advisers urged negotiation, Edward bristled. Kings did not negotiate with daughters. That belief held until it didn't. By winter's approach, the crown prepared a final measure, not compromise, correction. Joan sensed the turn before it was spoken. The force was coming, publicly, decisively. She did not move. She prepared to let authority expose itself. What the king planned next would decide whether England's law belonged to the crown, or whether the crown still needed consent to rule. The reckoning would arrive soon. Winter closed in on England in late 1297, and with it the king's patience. Edward ordered a public resolution, convinced exposure would restore order. If the marriage could be shown improper, it would be undone. If the husband could be shamed, the wife would yield. Authority prepared to speak at last. Joan received notice without ceremony. She was to present herself, answer questions, and submit corrections. The language was careful, almost gentle, as if restraint itself could compel obedience. She read it once, folded the parchment, and waited. Her position was now visible to everyone who mattered. Clerics compared records. Lawyers measured precedent. Nobles watched the king's hands more than his words. The law did not move quickly, but it did not forget, and it did not favor reversals once recognized. Edward believed the moment belonged to him. He believed time had weakened her. He did not see what time had done instead. It had fixed the facts. Marriage, pregnancy, recognition. Each day had hardened them. Ralph remained imprisoned. That, too, was part of the calculation. Break the man and the woman would follow. It had always worked before. Joan stood where she was, unmoved by summons or threat. She did not appeal to mercy. She appealed to nothing. She allowed the structure to reveal itself. The court gathered, expecting submission. What followed would force authority to confront its limits. By the end of 1297, nothing had been resolved, and that was the point. The crown had acted with force and found it insufficient. Lands were taken. A husband was imprisoned. Commands were issued, yet the structure held. Joan of Acre did not retreat, did not negotiate, did not perform repentance. She allowed authority to exhaust itself against legality. This was the moment history rarely records clearly. No battle, no proclamation, just power discovering it could not move forward without breaking something it depended on. Edward I still wore the crown, he still commanded armies. But here, against one woman who refused to be repositioned, he found no clean victory. Every action now carried a cost. Escalation threatened legitimacy. Delay suggested weakness. Joan had not attacked the crown. She had simply withdrawn consent. And in doing so, she exposed a truth older than monarchy itself. Power cannot function alone. It requires recognition. It requires agreement. The king stood at a threshold he had never faced. To crush his daughter was to fracture the law. To yield was to concede precedent. Part 1 ends here. Not with resolution, but with pressure. Because in Part 2, authority must choose whether it will rule by force or survive by concession. Backhand index pointing right in the next part, a prisoner will speak, the church will shift, and a king who never knelt will be forced to bend. Power always moves on. History decides who mattered. If this story stayed with you, there are others waiting. History rarely rewards the people who change it. This is a historical power story. Watch Part 2.